Everybody, welcome back to another episode of Writers Chat. My name is Johnny Alexander. I'm here with my co-hosts, Jan Martin and Brandy Rowe, and with our very special guest, and we're going to turn it over to Jan to introduce her.
Hello, I'm really excited to see Kristen. It's been quite a while. Her bio states that she was raised by parents who were techies before anyone coined the word techie. So naturally, she specializes in speculative fiction, fantasy, science fiction, and all of the related genres like cyberpunk, steampunk, and all the other types of punk. She started billing herself as a mentor rather than a copy editor at the suggestion of one of her clients. She noted that she did way more for her than just correcting punctuation and sentence structure. Her hope is to go above and beyond editing copy. Her goal is to serve readers by helping writers and publishers deliver great books. She studied writing her whole life, literally as long as she can remember. Love for writing and publishing led her to the Orlando Business Journal, a weekly newspaper for executives and small business owners, where she worked for 20 years before starting her freelancing full-time in December of 2011. I know she's also taught at Florida Christian Writers Conference editing and has been a terrific help to me. It's a blessing to introduce you to Kristen Stieffel.
Thank you, Jan. One of my passions as an editor is to teach writers how to edit. So I'm really excited to be here today to teach you this material, because when I started studying to be an editor, I learned things that I had never learned as a writer. As Jan mentioned, I've been studying writing my whole life. Like a lot of you, I went to the conferences, I read the books, I studied creative writing in college. But it wasn't until I became an editor that I started learning some of these things. And then I got kind of angry because I'm like, why aren't we teaching this to writers? So I'm kind of like on a mission now to teach writers what I have learned about editing. Because here's the thing, we always hear that great writing means revision, means rewriting, means editing. But then we don't teach writers how to edit. And so writers think that editing just means reading your manuscript over and over again until there are no more mistakes in it. And there's so much more to it than that. The problem is when you do it that way, you're doing it haphazardly. You delete words and move commas around, and is this hyphenated or not hyphenated? And meanwhile, there may be great big plot holes that you're not seeing because you're so close to the manuscript. And you can continue doing that indefinitely. And so it's no wonder that some people reach this stage of the journey and never submit their manuscript, because how do you know when it's done? How do you know when it's ready to submit? Well, without a system, you don't know, you don't finish. And many, many writers wind up in this infinite loop of just revising the manuscript indefinitely. So the method I learned as an editor helps get you out of that loop, because it lets you know when you're finished. So the secret to knowing when you're finished is to use a checklist. And I have to find the right screen to share. So I should have started these earlier. So we're going to use a checklist. The principle behind using a checklist is that it focuses and directs your editing attention on one element at a time. So you work more efficiently, you solve more problems, and most importantly, you know when you're finished. The more complex a task is, the more you need a checklist for it. So for example, you do not need a checklist to get in your car and drive to the grocery store. You may need a checklist once you get to the grocery store to make sure you get everything. But to just drive your car around, you don't need a checklist because it's not that complicated. For astronauts to fly to the moon, they needed a checklist because it was a very complicated task. So there's two kinds of checklists. There's the read do checklist, where you read the step and then you complete it. And I just realized there's a typo on my slide. Then the other type of checklist is the do confirm checklist. You do all the things you think you're supposed to do, and then you confirm you did them all. So that first type, the read do list, that's the kind the astronauts use. They read the list, they do the task. Then they read the next task and do it. The kind of checklist editors use is the do confirm checklist. We read through the manuscript. Did the author do all the things they think they're supposed to do? And I go down the checklist and confirm whether they did that. So the checklist I'm going to give you is the one based on what I use when I'm editing. I will drop it at the chat in the end of the talk. I am pleased to share this with you because it's not only been valuable to me as an editor, it's been valuable to me as a writer. The goal of this session is to help you self-edit your book the way a professional editor would, so that when you get to the end of the checklist, you know you're ready to submit. So the first time I taught this workshop, one of the feedback comments I got was that it seemed like I was talking about how to develop a novel. Yes, because developmental editing is a thing. So in developmental editing, we're primarily concerned with structural issues like character and plot and pacing. So another way that developmental editing is described is as it's the process of bringing the book into existence. It's making structural revisions to what is already written. It may also mean adding things to fill a plot hole or round out a character. It may also mean taking things out. Talk to the editor of my first book and find out about the 80,000 words we cut out of that book. So that's developmental editing. Other types of editing include substantive editing, which is when you're doing your rewrites. That may also include addition and deletion of scenes. Substantive editing can also be smoothing out the awkward parts where the dialogue isn't quite realistic and that kind of thing. The tricky thing about, especially if you're talking with a freelance editor about what kind of editing you need, is that different editors use different terms for the same thing. So some people use the term content editing, and some of them, when they say content editing, they mean what I'm calling here developmental editing. Others mean substantive editing. So when you're talking with an editor about editing your book, make sure that you are defining the kind of editing you're asking for the same way they do. So ask them, okay, if they're doing a substantive edit for you, what does their substantive edit include? Or if they're offering you a content edit, well, okay, what do you mean by content edit? What does that cover? That's a fair question to ask, because the terms in editing are not covered by ISO 9000. They're not any standard definitions. So it's worth having a conversation about to make sure that you and your editor have the same definition of the kind of editing you're asking for. Next is copy editing. This is when we look at not only the sentence structure and the grammar, but also the flow. Is the sentence awkward and we need to fix it? And then proofreading is the thing that a lot of people are talking about when they're talking about editing. But really, proofreading is just the absolute last step in the production process before you actually publish the book. And it's correction of not only things like typos and commas in the wrong place, but layout issues. When the manuscript is converted from Word into InDesign or whatever page layout program, or when it's converted to ebook, sometimes weird little errors can creep in, like there was a paragraph return at the end of a line that you didn't notice when you were looking at it on screen because it looked fine, but then when it gets converted to ebook, there's a paragraph break in the wrong place. That kind of thing is what proofreaders look for. Before you do any of the things I'm about to tell you, first you have to finish your manuscript. And I'm on the wrong slide. Okay. This method that I'm about to explain to you is is not effective on a partial manuscript. It's really only effective on a complete manuscript. So, because one of the first things we're going to look at is plot, and you can't really analyze the plot until you have the whole plot. So many of the problems in your manuscript won't be apparent, or you won't know how to fix them until you've written the whole thing. So first, finish your manuscript. Writing and editing are two different mindsets. And if you try to do them at the same time, you can trip yourself up, because writing is creative and it's proactive, and editing is refining and it's reactive. So finish your manuscript first. I recommend turning off your inner editor when you're doing your first draft. Some writers have a process where they'll write part of the manuscript, then they revise that part of the manuscript before they do the next part of the manuscript. If that works for you, fine. I don't recommend it. I recommend blitzing through, write the entire first draft, especially if you're a discovery writer, write the whole first draft, because you can get caught up in an editing loop and not finish. And it's really important that you finish. Here on the slide is a quote from Mary Burton, who said, "The worst thing you write is better than the best thing you did not write." So just write your first draft. Once you finish, assuming you're not on a deadline, let it sit for a while you go work on something else or take a vacation. You want to be able to come to the manuscript with fresh eyes. And the first thing you want to do is do a fast read through. Ideally, you want to read through your book in as short a time frame as possible, so you have the whole story in your head at once. I recommend doing this in a version that's different from the way you wrote it. So if you wrote it on a desktop, read it on a laptop or a tablet. If you wrote it on a laptop, read it on a tablet or on paper. Do whatever's most comfortable for you, but just don't do it on the same computer where you're doing your writing, because you want to change the location so you can change your mindset. And as you're reading, you want to, as a pastor of mine used to say when we were reading one of those Bible passages that you've seen a million times, he would say, let's try to look at this with fresh eyes. And that's what you want to do when you're reading your manuscript. You want to try to forget that you're the one who wrote it and read it as a reader who's coming to it for the first time. And what readers are looking for is a powerful story. Well, what do we mean by story? My personal definition of story is sympathetic characters plus a profluent plot equals an engaging story. You have to have both. You have to have both sympathetic characters and a profluent plot. Even in, the lofty literary fiction that supposedly doesn't have a plot, there's a plot. It may be a very quiet plot. It may have what they call, the technical term is low narrativity, where there isn't a lot happening, but something is happening. Even in nonfiction, you need these elements, because nonfiction that uses stories is more memorable than nonfiction that's just data. So let me define this word profluent, because I think not enough of us learn it. If you see that word fluent in there, it's related to fluid, and it means flowing like a river. The plot, and we'll talk about this more as I get further into the talk, but the plot needs to be a chain of events that are cause and effect. In other words, each thing happens because of the thing before, not just after the thing before. And that's what we mean when we say profluent. So as you're reading, don't edit. And this is another good reason for getting it off of your computer into some other form, so you're not tempted to do editing while you're reading. You just want to get the big picture and maybe make some notes about things that you want to change. You want to look for the big picture stuff, your character, your plot, but you're going to fix them later. If you try to fix them while you're doing the read through will take too long. One thing you can do while you're doing your read through is make a style sheet. This is another of the editor's tools that we don't often teach writers about. The style sheet helps ensure that you keep things consistent through your manuscript. Ideally, you'll make it while you're writing, But if your draft is already finished, go ahead and make it while you're doing your read through. You want to note descriptions, dates that things happen, names of people and places. If you're writing a speculative world where you've invented words, you want to put your invented words on the style sheet. This not only helps you make sure that you're doing things consistently throughout your manuscript, but then when you turn the manuscript over to the copy editor, if the copy editor has the style sheet, they can double check that the characters' names are spelled the way you intended to spell them. I mean, when we're making up fantasy names, it's easy to spell the name wrong. Even in the real world settings, is Catherine spelled with a K or is Catherine spelled with a C? Put it on the style sheet. The copy editor will know if they see a Catherine with a K and it's check the style sheet. Yes, that's correct, or no, it's not. You want to include descriptions of the characters, especially in your style sheet, because that will help you prevent errors like, I literally saw this in a historical novel that was actually published. The heroine's eyes were brown at the beginning of the story and green at the end. Now, in a speculative fiction story, we can totally accomplish that with an eyeball transplant, but this was historical fiction, so that doesn't work. So that was just a mistake. Having a style sheet will help you avoid that kind of mistake. There's a lot of ways to organize the style sheet. I tend to group them. So I'll put characters in one part of the style sheet, places in another, and then invented words in another. Another pro tip, some words have multiple valid spellings. So for example, advisor can be spelled ER or OR. Pick the one you prefer, put it on your style sheet, and that way your copy editor doesn't change it. Or gray can be spelled GRAY or it can be spelled EY. Putting it on your style sheet will help prevent your copy editor changing it to the one you don't prefer.
Kristen, do you
yes.
want to say anything about deity pronouns? Because I think that's something that we run into a lot.
Yes.
The things that we write. So
that's an excellent point. Yes, that should go on your style sheet. And this actually came up in my fantasy book. So thank you for mentioning that. Yeah. The Christian Writer's Manual of Style recommends against deity pronouns. In other words, when you're referring to God as he, you would lowercase the h. And that's because that's how most of the current translations have it. Some don't. The NASB does not. The NASB capitalizes deity pronouns. There are a couple of others, but the big ones, the NIV, the NRSV, even the King James Version, the deity pronouns are not capitalized. So that's why the Christian Writer's Manual of Style says don't capitalize deity pronouns. A lot of writers feel very, very strongly about capitalizing deity pronouns. If you're one of those writers, put it on your style sheet. My preference is to capitalize deity pronouns, but here's the trick. If you're going to do that in your book, make sure that the scripture quotations in your book come from one of the translations that also capitalizes deity pronouns. Otherwise, your book's going to look inconsistent. So that advice goes for contemporary and nonfiction. In my fantasy story world, I decided to capitalize deity pronouns because in my fantasy story world, 2 of the persons of the Trinity are referred to with feminine pronouns. So I chose to capitalize deity pronouns just to draw extra attention to the fact that, you know, the creator is a she. So thank you, Johnny, for bringing that up. I should make a note to discuss that in the future when I do this. One of the reasons you want to put dates on your style sheet is to make sure that everything stays in chronological order. It is very easy when you're writing to get scenes out of order. And that's one of the things we look for when we're editing, is making sure that everything's in the right place. And I'll talk more about that later too. Once you've completed your read through, you're going to devise an editing plan, and you're going to use the checklist as a guide to help you do that. One thing you want to consider is making a book map, and I'm going to talk about how to do that. Once you've finished reading your manuscript, you're going to have a stack of notes to work from. You're going to identify the biggest problems, and hopefully at this point you will be able to ignore the little ones, because we're going to save those for later. Ideally, you're going to make several passes through your manuscript, and the key is to make those passes in the appropriate order. So the 10 elements of fiction, and I don't know why my slides are not in the right order. The 10 elements of fiction, I divide into primary and secondary elements, not because the primary elements are more important, but because they need to be dealt with first. So if your manuscript is very rough, let's go back to here we go. These are the elements of fiction. If your manuscript is very rough, you may need to only make one pass. You may need to make one pass for each of the 10 elements. If it's in pretty good shape, you may only need to do one primary pass and one secondary pass. And usually with my clients, that's where they're at. I do a primary pass and then I do a secondary pass. So here's the key to developing your editing plan is to figure out how many passes you're going to need to make, how many pages you can edit a day, and then how many days it's going to take to get through your whole book. So keep track of how many pages you edit per day so you can build out that timeline as you go. So the elements of fiction here are in order of importance according to me. This is not by any means an industry standard. I put character first because readers want characters they can care about. You may hear that you need a likable protagonist. I don't think your character needs to be likable as long as they're admirable in some way. So that's the main thing. And viewpoint is closely related to character. So you may be able to combine those and do both of those in one pass. Viewpoint is the channel through which the reader receives the story. So so that's really key, and it needs to be early in your editing process that you nail down your viewpoint. Plot, structure, and pacing are all related. If your manuscript is pretty clean, you can usually combine those into one. And setting, I used to have setting under secondary elements because then it was nicely balanced. I have 5 elements in each section and I like that. But then I realized setting really needs to go in the primary category, because if you change it, it can have a cascade effect on the rest, whereas the reverse is not so much true. So, excuse me. So then you want to do all those things first before you go on to editing your description, dialogue, voice mechanics, and so forth. So one of the tools that we use to examine the plot is book mapping. If your read through identifies major structural issues with your book, you will find a book map to be useful in fixing them. I've actually reached the point where I've just started building a book map anytime I'm editing a client book, because it helps me to visualize the book's contents. And a lot of times I found that I was getting partway into a book, discovering a problem, and then having to go back and rebuild the book map. So now I just build it from the beginning. So you may have used a book map without even realizing that's what you're doing. I know that's what I did. A book map is really just a visual way of rendering your outline. And there are many different ways to accomplish that. And I'm going to go over some of them. You may have heard these called story grids or plot charts or beat sheets. Anything that's more complex than just an outline can be called a book map. And I think a lot of writers tend to come up with these techniques instinctively. I made my first book map without knowing that's what it was going to be called. I just called it my plot chart. The world's most famous book map is J.K. Rowling's book map for Order of the Phoenix. This got shared by one of the editors from Scholastic Books, who was the continuity editor for the series when it was published in the US. So this is not even the whole book. This is just chapters 13 through 24. You see the chapter numbers down the left-hand side. And then she has a column for the time frame, the chapter title, and then what elements of the plot take place in that chapter. And then she's got a sub-column, another column for each subplot or character development. She did this for the whole book, and that really explains how she was able to write a very complex 7-book series and not only have the plot very cohesive, but also she was able to plant she planted clues at the beginning that paid off at the end. And I mean, it's one of the things that made it remarkable was the amount of planning that went into that series. So let's talk about how to make a book map. I tend to use a spreadsheet. This is my very first book map that I ever made, and I didn't know it was a book map. This is the plot chart for my book, Hope and Pride, which is as yet unpublished because it's the first book in a 3-book series. I haven't written the other 2 books yet. And I learned from Sharon Hank, who, like me, deals with chronic health issues. Her editor had her write all 3 books in her most recent trilogy, and then they published them because with her health concerns, there was a concern that they might get partway into the series and have a big gap, which is exactly what happened with my fantasy series. So anyway, that's why this book isn't published yet. So I'm waiting until I can write the other 2 books in the series. So you see here, I've got a scene number, whose POV is it? Have I written it? Because I was planning ahead. A 1-sentence summary of the contents of that scene, and then which subplots that scene related to. And you can see some scenes only hit 1 plot arc, but most of them hit more than 1. Most of them hit at least 2, and I think a couple hit 3. So that's something to think about as you're building your book map. And we'll talk more about how to build the book map in a minute. We talked about timelines and how to keep the timeline straight. In addition to making the plot chart for Hope and Pride, I also used a calendar so I could keep the timelines straight. So there's this great website. It's called Vertex 42. And they have all kinds of Excel spreadsheets, but one of them is a perpetual calendar. So if you're writing historical fiction, if you're writing fiction set in the future, you can download this calendar, plug in what year you want it to start on, and then it will calculate, well, what days of the week do the dates fall on? And, when is Easter going to be that year? So that can be really, really helpful. Then there's Scrivener. I don't know how many folks we have here are using Scrivener, but I love it. It has a very steep learning curve, but holy cow, once you learn how to use it, it's incredibly powerful. Over here on the left is the scene list. Each scene is treated as a document, and then you can put the documents in folders. This is the manuscript for my book, Tales of the Phoenix, which is 3 novellas. So Flight is the first novella, and then that's all the scenes that are in that novella. And Storm is the second novella, and then those are the scenes. And one of the things that's cool about this is then when you if you want to change the order of scenes, you can just drag them around. So for example, when I was working on Lena's Privilege, which is the 2nd book in my fantasy series, it's due to my editor next month, pray for me. I realized about 3/4 of the way into writing the book that the main character wasn't who I thought it was. I thought it was going to be Cameron's story. It turns out it's actually Lena's story. So I had written the first 3 chapters all about Cameron, and I realized I needed to pull Lena's chapters up to the top. Well, in Scrivener, that was super easy. I just grabbed those folders, dragged them up to the top, and then I just had to make sure the timelines were correct. So I wouldn't call this Scrivener sidebar a book map, but it's very like a book map. It's a very, very robust for an outline. Scrivener's outline view definitely qualifies as a book map because here you have a synopsis of the scene. You can use the label to show whose point of view it's in. You can make a status column. They allow you to include your word count goal. And I choose to put the modified date there. The great thing about Scrivener is you can completely customize this to make these columns whatever you want them to be. It's incredibly robust. There's also a website, I'm going to drop it in the chat box, called Hiveword that has something very similar. Hiveword is not as full featured as Scrivener, but the base account is free, or at least it was the last time I looked. And HiveWord also includes some tools from James Scott Bell to help you plot your book. So I highly recommend it. And then the other thing that's great about Scrivener is this Corkboard View. So this takes the kind of old, use index cards to plot your novel method and makes it virtual. And this is cool because if you drag these cards around, you can change the order of the scenes in the manuscript, because each card is just a placeholder for that scene. Of course, you could also do this too with actual index cards if that works for you. You just need a big enough corkboard to put them on. Now, I happen to like spreadsheets and I happen to love Scrivener, but a more graphic representation may work for you if you believe, as one of my editors does, that a spreadsheet is antithetical to coherent communication. So hopefully you're familiar with Freytag's pyramid. Usually this gets taught in writing classes. It's the traditional inciting incident, escalation of action, moment of truth, resolution, final state. You can draw this out for your story, and this this slide here represents the character's internal state, their internal state at the beginning, their character flaw, the inciting incident that sets them on their path, where they have their epiphany or their moment of truth. Sometimes it's called the dark night of the soul, and then they go through the declining action into reaching their final state. You can also use this kind of a thing to plot out the external action, where you have your inciting incident. You might have some try-fail cycles, and then the falling action into the denouement. And then you can also overlay these two so you can see how the external plot relates to the internal character arc. Because of concerns about permission, I'm not going to share some of the other plot graphs that I have found online, but if you do a Google search on Google Images or on Pinterest for a plot chart template, you will find more ideas than you can maybe handle. There are just a ton of them out there. If you're a kinesthetic learner, you may prefer something hands-on instead of digital, and there are plenty of options for this. Heidi Fiedler teaches book mapping for the Editorial Freelancers Association, and she has assembled this Pinterest board called Book Mapping Like an Editor. And she collects the different ways that people have mapped out their books. So there's a whiteboard, there's just a piece of paper with writing on it, there's sticky notes, not on this snapshot, but she's also got, index cards. People have been known to use butcher paper, anything that gets your ideas onto a space where you can see them and work with them all at once. Anything you do like that can be considered a book map. So once you've built your book map, what do you do with it? So in order to demonstrate this, I have created a fictional book map because I didn't want to share any book maps from novels that I've edited, because I feel like that would violate my confidentiality with my clients. But also I wanted to put a lot of the kinds of mistakes that I find into one book map, because usually one manuscript isn't going to have all of these problems. But so this is kind of an invented example of what a book map might look like and how I would use it. So for example, one of the things I check is the length of the chapter, and what we want to look for is places where there's one chapter that's wildly short or way too long. You can vary the length of your chapters, and keep in mind that when you do so, it controls the pacing. So if you have one chapter that's really short, there should be a reason for that. If you have one chapter that's really, really long, it's going to feel like the story just comes to a halt at that point. Now, mind you, you can do that on purpose. If, for example, in Mantle, the 4th book in the Winter series by Oliver King, he has one really, really long chapter, and it's because, okay, this is a speculative novel. Time has literally slowed down and the characters are traveling through time to all kinds of different places. And so that chapter is long to make you feel that sense that they have stopped time so they can go and do all these crazy things that they're doing. Especially in nonfiction that has multiple elements, the book map can be used to ensure that everything's in place. So for example, here we've got chapter titles except for these 2 chapters. And if you were just reading through the manuscript, you might miss that if you're not looking for it. But if you have to stop and write the chapter title down on the book map, you're going to catch it when it's missing. Same here with the epigraphs. 2 chapters have the same epigraph. We don't want to repeat those. Another one has no epigraph. So we want to fix that. Here's a case where the book map can help us find some plot issues. So here in column G, we have the main storyline for the heroine. In column H, we have the hero. And in column I, we have the sidekick. And she goes off on a little side quest all by herself. And we have 4 chapters where we're not visiting the main characters. Now that we see this big gap here in the story, what are we going to do about it? And it will depend on the manuscript. We have to decide whether the sidekick's subplot is critical to the story and needs to be woven in with some chapters or scenes that include the hero and the heroine, or is that a separate little story all of her own and it needs to come out of this book and go into maybe a short story? That's the kind of thing that a book map is good for revealing. Here at the end of the book map, we find a case where, each chapter ending with a journal entry from the heroine, except some of them are out of order and one of them is missing. Where I often see this is in nonfiction, where there may be a journal prompt or discussion questions at the end of a chapter. You want to make sure that every chapter has those elements, but also what happens sometimes is one chapter will have 2 discussion questions, another will have 8. And we want to balance those out. They don't all have to be exactly the same, but we want to get them close to the same so that it feels consistent. Okay, so when you've found problems with your plot using the book map, what do you do about it? Well, one of the tools you can use to solve this problem is called story breaking. This is primarily a screenwriting technique. It's usually used at the content creation stage, but you can use it in editing to help you fill a plot hole. Because what story breaking does is it identifies each necessary element of a scene. So it's sometimes also called a beat sheet or a step sheet. It's identifying the indispensable plot points, and one scene can have multiple plot points. So if a book map identifies a gap in the narrative, story breaking can help you fill in the gap. If we suddenly jump from point A to point M, story breaking can help us fill in the stages that we need, or we can also use it going backward. And I did this with Lena's Privilege. I got to a point where I was about 80% of the way into the manuscript, and I wasn't sure what came next, but I knew what the ending needed to be. So starting from the ending, I broke the story backward. Well, what has to happen to set that up until I close the gap? So that's a good way to use story breaking. Okay. Once you've done that, now you start working the checklist. You've mapped out your book, you've compiled your notes for the read through. Now you're ready to begin editing. You want to do it in order. Editing is like triage, the same way the doctor has to treat the most life-threatening wound first and then deal with others. If you find that your character and your viewpoint are in really good shape, but your plot needs an overhaul, do the plot pass first, then do the character pass. But if your characters need developing, do that first and worry about the plot holes later, because if you change the characters, you may change how they react to events of the plot. So you're going to use the checklist to build your plan, and then you execute as many passes as you need to address each element in turn. After the first read through, I usually take one pass to deal with the primary elements and a final pass to deal with the secondary elements. But, you know, I've been doing this for years. I've had a lot of training and practice. So you may find it easier to just do one at a time, or like I said, some of them can be combined. So did I put a slide in here for nonfiction? I did not. The list for nonfiction is shorter, but it's similar, because instead of character, you have personality. And if you're writing a memoir, that personality will be your personality. Nonfiction also includes elements like presentation, voice, and then there's information, the fact checking, and then mechanics. So there's some similarity, and for narrative nonfiction, you need a combination of the two, and I will give you the narrative list also. The goal here is to save yourself the trouble of editing secondary elements that wind up being deleted or rewritten because of changes to the primary elements. So for example, and this is why setting is in the primary category, if you change the setting of your novel from Victorian London to Roaring 20s New York City, the dialogue and the descriptions are all going to change. If you're using deep character point of view, even the voice is going to change because it's going to reflect an American rather than a British voice. So often we obsess over the mechanics, especially in critique groups, but that's actually the last thing you want to deal with, because there's no point ensuring that you styled King's Cross Station correctly if you wind up changing it to Grand Central Terminal. So that's why setting is a primary element, and that's why we do the elements in order. Now, mechanics are last, not because they're least important, but because we have to wait to the end to do them. Because if you rewrite the scene because the dialogue is unrealistic, then you're going to need to proofread it to make sure it's spelled correctly. So that's why we put that at the bottom of the list. But the other thing to remember is that if you get the stuff at the top of the list right, if you have great characters and a profluent plot and an intriguing setting and a great voice, the editor can work with mechanics. They can hire somebody like me to fix the spelling and the grammar. I spent a lot of time in the early years of my writing career focused on, if I could just write great sentences, then I'll be a great writer. And so I wrote this, 180,000 word epic fantasy novel that had no plot. So don't be me. Focus on your character and your plot first, and save the mechanics for last. Focusing on mechanics makes me a great copy editor, but it didn't make me a great novelist. I had to do other things I had to master the character and the plot in order to get there. By making a separate editing pass for each element in turn, you give yourself space to focus on that one thing before you move on to the next. And that kind of methodical approach will make your editing easier, as well as making it better. So another reason for using the checklist is we want to avoid analysis paralysis. A client once asked me, after we'd gone through 3 editing passes, how many times we could go back and forth with him making revisions and me checking and correcting them. And I told him, you're paying me by the hour. We can do this as long as you want. But there is a point of diminishing return, where the hours you invest in tweaking and revising and polishing don't produce enough of an improvement in the finished manuscript to make it worthwhile. You have to know when you've reached the point where you're not making it better, you're just making it different. And hopefully the checklist will help you focus so that you can know that you've achieved each element to the best of your ability. When you look at it all at once, the checklist can be a little daunting. And that can exacerbate one of the problems that all writers have, and that is wavering between believing that we are literary geniuses whose work deserves to be read by everyone in the world and believing we're hack posers that no one will ever take seriously. Yes, not just you. The danger in self-editing is falling too severely to one side or the other. In his letter to the Romans, the Apostle Paul says, "For by the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you, not to think of yourself more highly than you ought to think, but to think with sober judgment, each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned." And thinking of our writing with sober judgment not only means not thinking too highly of ourselves, but also not thinking too lowly of ourselves. We need to think realistically. As Sherlock Holmes once said to Dr. Watson, to underestimate oneself is as much a departure from truth as to exaggerate one's own powers. So we're looking for the middle way. We want to trust our instincts as writers, but we also want to be willing to make changes. So look for the opportunities to improve, but also be aware when you reach that point of diminishing returns. You need to trust your literary skill and silence that voice in your head that says you're a hack. Lastly, the checklist helps you know when to ship. When you have gone through every element in the checklist and addressed every one of them to the best of your ability, you are finished. That's how you know you're done. At that point, you need to let it go. And what it means to ship will vary depending on where you are in your writing journey and what kind of publishing you're pursuing. So if you're a new writer, you may want to, at this point, turn it over to beta readers and get some feedback from other people. If you start submitting to agents and editors, you may get feedback that's really specific, or you may get feedback that's really generic, like does not meet our needs at this time. Most useless rejection in the world. It'll be up to you to decide how to use the feedback you get. But by the time you've gone through this checklist, your manuscript should be in pretty good shape. Beta readers can help you identify story problems. Once you've gotten feedback from half a dozen beta readers or so, you'll be able to tell whether that feedback is consistent or not. It's absolutely possible to get completely opposite feedback from different readers. I had a scene where I was describing a royal palace, and one of my critique partners said the description was boring and he started skimming. And another critique partner said, oh, she loved the description because it was so beautiful and poetic and really made her feel like she was there. So yeah, it's possible to get conflicting feedback, and you need to know what your style is as a writer in order to make use of that feedback. If you are going to self-publish, I would not go through this checklist and then publish. You at least want to hire a copy editor, because no one can ever really copy edit their own work. You want to at least get one other set of eyes on the manuscript, preferably more. The more proofreaders you can get before you go to press, the better. But the important thing is not to get too hung up on the checklist. It's meant to offer a set of guidelines, but it is not rules. It is a set of best practices that writers and editors have found useful. Many qualities are subjective and hard to quantify, like a sympathetic character. Well, okay, to whom? My Doctor Who fans in the audience will know that there's a character in Doctor Who her name is Donna Noble, and fans either love her or hate her. There's very little middle ground. Is she a likable character? I think so. I love her. Other people don't. So you need to, again, tap into your instincts. Think about the kind of writing you want to do. Think about the kind of reader you want to reach, and then judiciously apply the feedback from your readers. So that's what I have for you today. Know your audience and your style, Melissa. Yes, that's it exactly. That is the key. A lot of times I will talk to writers who want to do things in a particular way. And I need to remind them that, okay, if you choose to do it in that way, you are choosing a subset of readers. And, you know, the checklists are designed to help us edit books in ways that are going to appeal to the most readers. But maybe you don't want to appeal to the most readers. Maybe you want to appeal to a particular set of readers. And that's fine. That is totally allowable. Now I need to figure out how to turn screen sharing off. Where am I? There we go. Excuse me.
Right, that was great. I really loved the book mapping and could do a deeper dive into that subject. I think that was fabulous. Wow. Yeah, that was wonderful. Well, we've got a few minutes, so anybody that wants to come back on, I'm not sure we had many questions really, but if you have anything you want to ask, please let us come on and ask it. And I am going to try to get those people out of jail. In jail. So if you're stuck, let me know.
We could have Kristen come back and teach the mapping.
I think that would be wonderful. Yes, I do. Okay. All right. Is there anyone that's stuck and can't get on? Let me know in the chat. Anybody have any questions or comments about anything Kristen talked about? Yeah, it was amazingly informative. I agree.
Yvonne, I saw your hand.
Yes, I'm a nonfiction writer, and I was fascinated, and I saw many places where I can use it.
Oh, good.
Oh, yeah.
The calendar template.
Yeah, that is
mapping.
especially useful for memoir or any kind of historical writing. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. By the way, Kristen, I hope that wasn't my book where the heroine had started out with brown eyes and then they turned green. I hope that wasn't one of my books.
I don't think so.
Oh, good.
No.
I would worry about that. And I do, you know, I've been really bad about not making those, what do you call it, a plot chart?
Style sheet.
Style sheet. Yeah, where you've got everyone's hair color, eye color, etc.
I think you'll remember. I mean, because it's your character, right? And I've done that. I mean, I found it, so I didn't get through to the final copy, but I've done that too, is changed eye colors without meaning to.
Well, I think
if you don't remember it,
right, the easier it is to forget, you know. I don't know.
Yeah, it is. It is.
Well, thank you for being patient waiting for me. Honestly, I've been trying to get on for like 20 minutes before then, and I couldn't find the password.
Oh,
Sophia, did you have a question?
I had you've convinced me to actually try Scrivener maybe again. But I'm still working on this pass, which is primarily rewrites and stuff.
If you're editing a finished manuscript that's in Word, I wouldn't import a new manuscript into Scrivener just to finish up your last edits. But for composition, it's fantastic. Yeah.
Okay, that's good advice. The other thing is, can you share your slides with us, or are they protected?
Can I do that? I think I don't know that there's any real benefit in doing that. I'm going to give you a handout that's going to have the information that you really need.
Oh, good.
So I think the handout will be more beneficial to you than the slides.
I can only type so fast and pay attention to what you're teaching me.
Well, it's good. We will have the replay.
We'll have the replay. And we'll get the handout. We'll make sure that gets in the Writers Chat Facebook group. So you do have to be a member of the group to get access to the handout. Okay. All right. Anybody else? Any other questions? I thought I heard another voice, but I wasn't sure.
Yeah, I just wanted to, hey guys, I just wanted to just say what a great idea this was, because I think Kristen is totally right. And if any of us have ever been through the process of editing a manuscript to get it ready to publish, it totally changed how we wrote whatever came next. Like, we've all had that. I mean, maybe not everybody, but if you've had that experience, you're like, man, I wish I knew all this stuff before I wrote, that first time. And sometimes that's what you learn. But this was great that Kristen, for some people at least, can help them skip those steps. But along with the style sheet, this is the hack that I use. And when I tell writers about this, they like it, but it's probably not organized enough for maybe Kristen or anybody else. But I just put it at it's always the next page on my manuscript. So it's just as I'm just writing creatively, all I got to do is scroll down and add stuff to that sheet. It's not like a separate file. I don't have to go anywhere. I just real quickly can put it. So it's always at the point of progress. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's always at the point of, like, if I'm on page 97 writing, my style sheet, whatever you want to call it, where I've got all my names and all my stuff, it's just right that next page. All I gotta do is scroll down and peek at it.
Yeah, and whatever works for you, just make sure that comes out of your manuscript before you submit it.
No, absolutely.
Because of some horror stories that happened in the newspaper business, I have a real fear of putting anything in the manuscript that doesn't belong in print. So I know, like, some people will, instead of putting their comments using the comment feature in Word, they will just put it in the manuscript with brackets. And I live in fear of that kind of thing, because I've seen things go to press that way, and that is to be avoided. So that's just me. If it works for you to have it all in the same document, that's fine. I like to have it in a separate document, partly because I find it really easy to just switch between windows rather than scrolling up and down through the document. But then I say that, but in Scrivener, your style sheet is in the same package. It's just in a different folder. Your manuscript is in one folder in the sidebar, and your style sheet can go in another folder in the sidebar. So I was trying to drop the handout in the chat box, and I guess that doesn't work. So I'm trying to figure out how to get you all the.
If we'll work that out, and we'll make sure it gets that. So we'll talk about that after we get done with the recording. Yeah, I do my style sheet mostly in Excel, kind of like the book maps that she was talking about with my chapter stuff. It's kind of at the bottom anymore is where I stick it. There's those little notes I need to make, and that works for me because I can just go from my Excel to Word pretty quickly. So yeah, you just got to decide what works best. All right, well, we're getting to about an hour, so I'm going to go ahead and we're going to stop the recording first. Next week, Brandy, do you want to tell us what's going on next week? Was that you or Melissa?
I don't know what's going on next week. I didn't look.
I'm sorry, I picked the wrong co-host.
Next week, we're going to have James L. Rubart come on and talk about audiobooks. So it's going to be pretty exciting to have him back.
Nice.
That'll be fun. He's really great. So that'll be fun. All right. Well, thanks everyone for being here. If you're joining us by watching the replay, we appreciate that and ask that you feel free to join us anytime live. We do this almost every Tuesday morning at 11 o'clock Eastern. We're glad you're here or watching the replay. And we also invite you to join our Facebook group. Just look for Writers Chat and you can find us that way. Bye-bye, everybody. We'll see you next week.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Have a good day.